right. Thanks everyone for coming. As I mentioned, my name is Bill Pugh. I'm managing partner and co-founder for Smart Connections. And I'm joined here by a distinguished panel, and we're going to have a conversation around digital transformation and how we drive cities to be, well, we'll say smart, but how do we transform the cities using technology? I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Jones, and I'm a social science humanities research associate at UT Austin. And I also work for the City of Austin's Office of Resilience. So I have a foot in both worlds, which is really exciting. I get to work with professors and practitioners every day, and every day is different. And happy to speak on the Office of Resilience as well later on.
Hi, Sam Adams with the City of Portland.
Hi, I'm Al Brown. I'm the CTO for Veritone. We're a public AI company, and what we just saw in the previous one was very close to home, so I really love that we're talking about that here. We focus more on media entertainment, government legal and compliance, as well as on the energy verticals and HR technology. That was a little too close.
So, I mean, we're looking at cities across North America, and we're seeing right now the largest infusion of cash that's ever been deployed, at least in my lifetime. What, in your expert opinions, is paramount for us to get right in order for us to recognize a digital transformation that's going to effectively change the cities and the way we live?
I think that I spoke earlier, and I think that there's a lot of capacity building, frankly, that's needed in cities about exactly what this offer is and what cities might be eligible for, and what the value proposition, what are the strongest value propositions based on, there are 12,800 cities in the United States, and they each have their own context. So what's the value proposition that's sort of grounded in a city's reality?
Perfect. So one of the things that really excites me is how we can actually apply AI to cities and really hone in on this notion of ambient intelligence, and how do we actually start making cities smarter and leveraging all this data and all of this grants that are starting to come out. One of the things that excites me, going back to your point, was the infrastructure bill that was passed last year for $1 trillion had $500 million earmarked for smart grants, really just to help all the cities in the US to actually be better across. So I'm excited by that.
And then I would just echo, similar to Sam, that from the city side, we must kind of manage these funds in the same way we prioritize urgency for climate change and resilience globally. And this requires really thinking about all levels of government and working together. And also learning from each other, so different local governments learning from each other. And I think that's where, kind of put on the researcher hat or the university hat, that's where researchers can support practitioners in better understanding the landscape out there and what others are doing, and help identify best practices.
Great. So I've said it in several occasions in speaking engagements and everything that smart cities is one thing. So Al, I'm going to ask this question to you. But I've always said that you can't have a smart city unless you have a smart grid. The two have to go hand in hand. Without one, there is no other. What is Veritone doing with respect to grid resilience and things of that nature?
I'm glad you asked. So Veritone, one of our divisions is in energy, and what we focus on really is microgrid reliability and stability. And so we're entering this new era where we're actually producing power and we're having two-way grids, and how do we actually make renewables actually dispatchable on the grid? So that's an area of focus for us. One of the areas that inside of that we're looking at is how do we actually take fleets of EVs and actually use them for the grid when there's an actual event. So how do we take school buses, for example, if they're electric, and then take all the stored energy there and push it back into the grid in a reliable way to keep everything operating?
You know, that's interesting. So I'm gonna follow that same train of thought there, and say that, you know, so Sam, I'm familiar that with Portland and some of the things that they're doing over there, particularly with what we would call resilience hubs, which ties directly into what you were talking about, Al. Using the school buses and things of that nature for a resilience hub. Can you talk a bit about what that means to Portland and how you guys are implementing that?
Yeah, so Portland has 146 bridges, but if you ask Portlanders, they'll probably say a dozen that cross the rivers. But the rest of the bridges are the overpasses and, you know, all of those things. And we're sitting just off the coast of Oregon and Washington is a major fault that's like overdue by a lot. So at any moment, it's going to shift, and a whole bunch of those bridges are going to cut the city off, one area of the city off from another. So we started the Beacon project that had, and knowing that communication, especially 6 years ago when we started it, without the benefit of all the stuff we're talking about here, was pretty rudimentary. It was batteries that were kept energized with a local utility, and then different kinds of communications available depending on how bad the disaster was. I think we had 3 or 4 different kinds of communications, the ham radios and all that. So we're now trying to take that, where our ambition now is to take that to a higher level of sophistication, and to also have more, forgive me here, gizmos on those 146 or 7 bridges around, so that no matter where you're at in the city, you instantly know what your geographic, if there's a big earthquake, we also, you know, when it rains, when it rains a lot. When it snows 2 inches, the city shuts down. That's the way we are. But to know in real time, at least the bridges, are they up or down, and where is a viable path to go get other things. We're also, we found out in a recent study that we have 3 days of water, you know, inside the city. Our big reservoir is actually 60 miles out of town up in the Cascade. So we're trying to be smarter about emergency planning and using, in an emergency, more real-time sort of analytics around the status of the city. No matter where you're at in the city, you would have access to that.
I think that's awesome. Jessica, you have some experience with that, right?
So the city of Austin brought on a chief resilience officer 6 months ago, and one of the projects of the Office of Resilience is to create resilience hubs. And we have a kind of a launching program of 6 resilient hub sites along the Eastern Crescent, which is one of the most disadvantaged areas here within the city. And so the idea is to create a site that during blue sky, everyday events, folks could go for programming, support services, trainings, kind of like a rec center or a library already. And then during and after an emergency event, these likewise resilience hub centers could also provide support to the community. So this has been a really interesting, exciting, mind-opening journey for myself, just to engage the public on what is a trusted location, what would you like to see at a resilience hub site, to learn from others across the nation of how they're launching their resilience hub programming, and just really thinking about, you know, preparedness, response, and recovery, and what can that mean at a local site, and how do we engage residents and organize residents around these future sites. So a lot there. Happy to share the website later where you can see our work on this. And after these 6, we hope to kind of build the network and have a kind of hub and spoke model around the Resilience Hub effort here in Austin.
That's awesome. So I'm going to stay with you on this one. Everything that you guys have just talked to me about, or talked to all of us about, is not just the city in and of itself, but it's the city plus OEMs plus the education, higher education and things of that nature. And I think that, given the infrastructure bill and the dollars associated with it, it's really going to take an effort around public-private partnerships. Jessica, can you talk to us about what that looks like in the city of Austin?
I can give one example. So in the summer in 2020, we started, as a graduate student, I joined a working group within the city of Austin and UT researchers and community members on heat, urban heat, and urban canopy issues. And it was a kind of brainstorming group of, we know heat is an issue here in Austin and in Texas. Extreme heat, we are not foreign to the topic, but it is getting more severe. And what can we do about it? And so this group, an interdisciplinary group of researchers from all different departments at UT, a community organization, and students and city staff work together. And where we moved with that group is we slowly got accepted by NOAA to do a Kappa heat mapping initiative. So we got to map heat during a typical summer day here in Austin and kind of understand maybe like what does the landscape of heat look like during a summer day. And then from there, conduct community interviews, thanks to the leadership of the nonprofit. And they went out into the community and tried to understand, how does heat impact your everyday life? And if you could dream big about heat mitigation and heat strategies, what would you like to see in your community? And then we moved to heat mapping, so a participatory mapping exercise, having residents put on the map and recognize, this is where I experience heat, and this is where it's really hot when I'm walking to the bus or when I'm going to the grocery store. And then likewise, another mapping exercise of, I'd like to see a water fountain here, or a splash pad here, or more trees over here. And so this effort just keeps evolving and growing, and it's really exciting to see all these different partners coming around the table to focus on one issue, heat, and then strategize and bring in resources like the Kappa Heat Strategies mapping, and other resources just to further this effort and further this conversation on what can we do to mitigate extreme heat here in Austin.
And Sam, I know that public-private partnerships are a big deal as well. How are you guys approaching that?
Yeah, public-private, community-based nonprofit partnerships are a requirement for almost any big move in Portland. We're sandwiched between these massive economies of the Puget Sound area and the Bay Area, and then there's Portland. And I think the economy up north from us is 6 times the size of the Portland region, and the one south is probably 150 times. I don't know, it's very big. So if we're going to compete, a lot of the competition is just global, but there's a lot of competition for investment and talent and everything else between our 2 big competitors. So we have to be very strategic. We have to understand, what the context in which we're seeking to achieve a goal or to deal with a problem. And then, it's usually for the biggest stuff, all hands on the rope, on the, what do you call it? Paddle for the rowboat. I have a 2-hour difference in time, so I'm, struggling here. And so around these issues, we end up, we've got some great talent. The number 1 largest R&D center for Intel is in the Portland region, so we do partnerships with Intel, and they're working to become sort of more interested and better at partnerships. They're such a big company, it's not out of malice, it's just they are at a whole different level than a lot of cities, and that's why companies, national companies, international companies, like I said in my earlier presentation, I'm always looking for new partners to do new projects. We've got a lot to figure out, and for us, we don't just have that natural advantage of a big economy. We actually have to work together with public-private, labor, community-based organizations and nonprofits, and luckily we have the culture of of a strong culture for doing that.
That's awesome. Al, you know, and in the same vein, right, you're on the other side of that, right? So you're the OEM, you're working with the cities and the utilities. How do you see delivering the solutions that you're looking at from an AI perspective, because it requires data, and you have to be trusted with that data. So how do you see that relationship working with the cities and utilities?
Well, first thing I learned today is actually never use the word pilot. Always use the word beachhead.
Yeah, you
so
go.
that's what I learned. But yes, but we have to work very closely. What I would really say, and I'm going to quote a friend of mine that says, "No data, no model." So if you actually want something to be smart, or you want to automate something that's more like how we think, you actually have to have amazing data, and that data has to be more transparent. It has to be more public where it can be public. It's got to have good standards around it. So those are things that I would suggest to focus on. What I tend to see as we work with cities and utilities and others is that all this information is typically locked up in some vendor's historian somewhere, and it's not really shared. There's not a really common understanding of, for example, where's the heat map, right? Where is all this data so I can pull up a graph and see it? And so as we go forward and we work together, we really need to come together as a group, as really more humanity, and solve some of these problems, because it really is humanity's problems. And so trying to lessen the barriers that exist between us working together. And one of the big ones, at least on my side, is we have to pay people. We all have to pay people. And so I do need to make sure that somewhere there is procurement, some side works out somehow. But beyond that, we're all in the same boat, and we should all row together.
I think that's very true, and it's, you know, the other side to it. And whenever, you know, there's conversations, especially, I like to leave the tech to the side and kind of look at the smart city or digital transformation aspect of it as more, you know, more for the people. And if we have a conversation around that, it brings us back to the real foundation, which is connectivity. And so what I'm wondering is, again, the infrastructure bill itself talks about broadband connectivity and the importance of broadband connectivity, because without it, you're not getting your data.
Very true.
And without it, we don't have any means to actually establish, you know, a number of these foundational solutions or foundational outcomes. What, across the panel, what are your thoughts about broadband, and how do you envision it being used in the city, and from, you know, basically from your perspective as a whole?
I guess I'll just start saying that everybody needs access to broadband. It should be a universal utility. And that, as we saw with the pandemic, that, you know, those who had limited access or no access struggled, and school children, and I think that just brought it up, you know, back to light and at the forefront of how important it is, and you know, how important of a necessity access to broadband is. And just kind of bringing it back to these resilience hub idea is that there would be broadband connectivity at these centers that folks could go to charge their electronic devices, and then to access and communicate with loved ones and also get news. So just thinking about, you know, like, how can we create hotspots in the community and access points in the community, as well as, you know, of expanding access to broadband.
I guess I'll just, so most states have public utility commissions. Public utility commissions in most states have relatively small staffs. And the utilities that they're regulating, for profit or otherwise, usually have lots of staff. And so there is this dynamic across the nation where the utility, public service commissions, public utility commissions still get to call balls and strikes. Mm-hmm. But if they're barely getting by, just keeping up with the basic stuff right now, and yet, and it's this going to be, I think, increasingly obvious at what a kink in the hose they will be, not because they don't want to do more, but because in a lot of states, the utility commissions are kind of starved of staff, because the regulators tend to be the number one. They tend to be very high up in terms of giving resources to political candidates of all whether you're conservative or liberal. So I would just flag that smart grids and everything else, and when you're getting into communications that are also regulated by the public utility commissions in a lot of states, they just don't have the staff to deal with the speed of change and the speed of opportunity that is in front of us. And so I would just flag that as a real problem, and it's only going to get worse because now we actually have money for innovation and public-private partnerships, but they still have to sign off on everything.
Thank you. I would actually share that we need access to data. As a data practitioner, if you don't have it, you can't really do anything. But it's not just a good, reliable pipe. It's the fact that you have enough bandwidth in the pipe, that the pipe actually always works. Like, for example, sometimes when you try Wi-Fi, it doesn't work all the time. The other part of it is the coverage map, right? So if you're trying to roll out a smart city and you're trying to put up all these IoT sensors on all the bridges and so forth, and you want to collect that data, you actually have to make sure you have coverage there. Otherwise, you have to fall back to slower networks that can't provide as much visibility into it. So those are all the things that I would look at in terms of how we can help encourage more broadband throughout the city and throughout the surrounding areas.
You mean to tell me that those coverage maps I see on TV, on the commercials, aren't real?
Not to my knowledge.
I'm disappointed now.
And if, just one last thought. I mean, I don't see it happening any other way than public-private partnerships. They're just, the two together can do a lot, public and private, but we regulate. There's some money coming in to both directly to the private sector from the feds and some to cities. So it's got to be, we got to figure it out.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said there's a resource challenge. It's no longer a funding challenge, but it's a resource challenge because, in order to actually move the ball forward in a number of these areas, or we talk about AI, we talk about ML, we talk about these technology tools, but the city itself needs the resources that understand how to leverage that. The OEMs themselves need the ability to actually engage, and then the community needs to say, "Yep, I'm for that." And so there's a constant circular conversation that needs to be had.
That's why you're so rare.
Yes.
Can we put your glass of water?
So
I would just add on that like having a university city employee hybrid is so interesting and exciting. Just to see the university's commitment to support the city in resilience and sustainability efforts, to build this bridge between researchers and practitioners, researchers with those big, beautiful ideas, practitioners to ground truth and, actually implement. And it's been really exciting to live in this role since July, so still very new. But I would highly, highly encourage this kind of unique partnership between the research institution and the city or local government.
it's absolutely necessary. And likewise, I mean, I think that the utility and the city they need to come closer together. Shared infrastructure is a big deal. New infrastructure is a big deal. So, I mean, with that, I mean, I think, are there any questions from the audience?
This is more directed at you, Mr. Adams. Your previous presentation, as well as this one, scares the crap out of me. You seem to be playing extremely fast and loose with data. The data in real time that you're talking about collecting lets cities and public-private partnerships and eventually others know in real time where I am, what I'm doing, what I'm using, and that can be used for ill as well as good. Mm-hmm. We have the example of bad people using air tags to follow good people home and rob them, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. This is a lot of data. This data will not be secure. How do you prevent this data being malused?
Well, I'm glad I got your attention because a lot of this data is already public record.
Public record and accessibility are two totally different things.
Oh, I agree, but I'm just saying, a lot of this data, if somebody asked for it and paid the fee to extract it under Oregon's laws, which are pretty permissive on data, they would get it. And that, as you're noting, is a problem. So I think all the more reason why, cities need to have the expertise around the whole dimension of the issue. Not only the utilitarian aspects of it, but then, of course, the privacy aspects of it as well. And it's going to be really interesting in Oregon because Oregon has one of the most strongest public records and open meeting laws in the United States. It's really because, I guess, in the 40s things were bad on the other side. So your point is absolutely spot on in terms of this information, and as it becomes more extractable and people are willing and there are the resources to pay for it, not all nudges need to be public record. If you're going to do policy nudges based on sort of real-time data. But government has to decide that. That's the best way forward, and I hope they will.
Well, let me comment a bit on that one. Because there's over the course of the last, I'll say, 10 years, there's been a lot of trial and error as far as solutions go, the use of data, and things of that nature. And I think if you look at some of the things that the federal government has done to help reduce the exposure or the attack surface with respect to ransomware, with respect to citizen data and the use of that citizen data, you're seeing things like the government mandate SBOMs, software bill of materials, for devices that are sitting out in the field. And that includes your handset devices as well, to understand what firmware or what software is actually being downloaded to those devices. And there is a security chain of trust that's associated with it. So it's not necessarily that the data that's being used by a city is going to be in the clear, especially as we start to move down the track of audit and those types of things. But the aspect that I hear you speaking to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is more on the privacy side. And so now they're tying it. The federal government, NIST itself, is tying cybersecurity and privacy together, and they're listing a whole set of best practices.
Two things. One, there is no federal privacy law effectively in the United States when compared to Mexico or compared to the EU. And secondly, real-time sensor data can be used in all kinds of ways, and we're not just talking about handsets, but we're talking about how much bandwidth is going through the pipe in my house, how much water is going through that pipe in my house, where my automobile is, did I just cross this bridge or that bridge? So there's a much broader sense. Yes, cybersecurity is incredibly important, and I don't want stuff that I haven't authorized to get down to this device. But we're talking about stuff that I have no choice for if I'm going to be a participant in our society. If I own a home, I want water, I want power, I want broadband. That comes with certain now monitoring that can be used by folks for good or ill. So yes, the cybersecurity issue is incredibly important. I don't want to minimize that at all. But we're talking about another issue as well.
So I think the privacy aspects you bring up are very important, but a lot of this information is available today. What we don't really have access to today, generally speaking, unless you're part of the telco side or utility side, is access to how much power you're using, whether it's on a monthly basis or on some type of periodic interval. From my perspective, how do we get things smarter? It's important to respect privacy, but we have to have the data. We have to understand what's happening, so that way we can use it for good or that we can use it for ill. But it's really the community around that says these are the good uses and these are the bad uses, and that community needs to come together. In terms of other things where you're going about tracking cars and so forth, what we just saw, the session before this one, was taking the 10,000 cameras of basically of London and then scanning them, right? That technology kind of exists. We tend to leap into AIs like Skynet. It's all powerful, it does these things, and can be very bad. But the reality is that AI is nowhere near Skynet level of capabilities today. It's really more around, I'm happy if I can recognize a logo. I'm happy if I can recognize a license plate, but I don't know that license plate is necessarily yours, right? There's still a lot of other things to do to tie it together to say that this is actually you. I'm now starting to break your privacy. And one of the things that we should really all talk about and come together as a community is, what is our privacy? Do I really have to share my license plate when I'm on the road so that people can track me, right? Because you're on a public road. Is that public information at that point in time or not, right? Should only police have access to it or not? And those are the discussions that we as a community need to have. But from a data science and AI person, we have to have the data. If you want us to make things better and provide better automation for things, we have to have data around what's happening so that we can say, hey, here's a heat map. Here's where people are going. One of the projects we've talked about and actually worked on was, as people go in and out of elevators, get on or off floors, turn on the AC more or less, depending on how many people are actually there, so that I can make sure that the AC is right sized to the people actually on that floor, so I can reduce power, right? And so I can do that in a way where it doesn't impact privacy. Like, I don't need to know who is getting on or off the elevator, but we still kind of need that data, and maybe it's cameras and things like that. Does that help or make sense?
No, I understand what you're saying, it makes sense. And yes, we're not at Skynet yet, but having been in that part of the business for like 40 years, the amount of data that's available in near real time has only grown exponentially. And the demo we just saw was real-time camera monitoring, and California, 3 weeks ago, I think, passed a digital license plate bill.
Mm-hmm.
So the ease of use of understanding which car this is where eventually becomes, significantly easier.
It does, but that license plate is actually expensive and comes with a service, so you have to now pay a monthly fee to have a digital license plate when you could just stick a metal one on your car.
Sure.
So maybe the bigger problem is that there's a lot of data that's publicly available, but if you download a lot of different kinds of data and you use AI to combine them into knowledge that the general public doesn't understand, maybe that leads to knowledge that can be used in very bad ways, because I cannot foresee what kind of data can be derived from it.
So this is a very interesting question around how do we actually take information and derive knowledge and then onto wisdom and so forth. And I think that's something that we should discuss about as IT professionals or information professionals. But having said that, what you're really worried about is these larger companies, and I'll just say Facebook, Experian, and others, they already have more data than I can even dream about on every single person that uses their service and touches them in some way. Probably stuff you don't want them to know.
And Bill,
Yeah.
Oh, you got Jessica?
Just real quickly about building like community trust, and from researchers' standpoint, like researchers love data and collecting data, but like kind of ground truthing of having community voice at the forefront and guiding the project. And by being able to work with this nonprofit in the heat work, for reference, like they've been putting the community voice at the forefront and really reminding the practitioners and the researchers about the community needs and about the community experiences. And as this work continues and progresses, really showing, like all the data that we extracted from asking you interview questions about how heat impacts your daily livelihood, to having you map and show us where spaces are hot in the city, to dreaming big and wanting to see mitigation strategies, like being able to tell a story, right? And like really synthesize, here's the process that we went through, and here's how we're going to use that data to address heat in the community. So we're still in that process, but really just remembering that community should be at the forefront of this work, and having equity guidelines to really frame our work, and just remembering that community is the expert of what they want and need, and prioritizing their voices when we can in everything that we do.
All right, one last one over here. We'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of on the other side of the spectrum. You know, I think that it's clear that with digital transformation and, you know, open and real-time data, there's so much immense opportunity to make communities better. You know, I think my question is, you know, it's clear that public-private partnerships are going to be core to that, but with kind of the traditional procurement process that cities face and having to kind of validate and justify the individual value proposition, you know, how do you look at kind of the paradox of choice that comes with having all this money? And how do you ensure that, you know, these one-off projects don't miss out on the opportunity for interoperability and instead could almost lead towards, you know, more siloed data and more, you know, multi-stakeholder initiatives that just kind of create more of a challenge?
Procurement. It's a tough one. On the construction side, which the cities have a lot of more experience, or just a lot more volume, anything over 100, any project, any public works project over $125,000 in Oregon has to be bid out. But if it meets certain criteria, it doesn't have to be bid out by low bid. Low bid, I put that in question marks, but it can be based on the qualitative, the folks that are rating the proposals based on the completeness and depth of knowledge and experience and related good work done, and those become the points on which something gets awarded. And the low bid is becoming increasingly not the low price you end up paying for a whole bunch of reasons, especially now. So that's one thing. The other thing, it's in terms of, minority and women-owned sort of opportunities with this huge amount of money coming from the federal government, local requirements or local expectations, which the Supreme Court might water down in terms of affirmative type actions. But cities, rewarding joint ventures, if there aren't prime contractors in any of this work, there's a lot of opportunity here. It's going to move really quickly, and so the risk is, the risk is we won't see a generation of women and minorities, getting the on-the-ground experience because they don't get the contract, or the cities don't require joint ventures with large and small. So there is part of the bill, although it's pretty nascent and small, that's supposed to speed up projects. And I think the bridge fell down in which city and then came back and was already up. That's also good. So there are these, as you know, there are these sort of competing demands. Quick isn't always mean fair, and low price doesn't always mean the best value for your money. So there's a lot that we just have to keep an eye on the public sector in the next 36 months.
Okay, let's get this one.
Quick one. This is a comment for Jessica about the heat island. And I'm from the city of Phoenix, so I can honestly say we know heat better. So again, not a plug for my talk tomorrow. We're going to talk about heat island, and we partner with the university down there, whose logo is the pitchfork. So I'll be happy to talk about it and how we solve the problem. Well, we are in the stages where we call the beachhead. Trying to solve the heat island problems. Be happy to share.
No, I appreciate that. And, learning from what other cities are doing to address heat, even if it's looking at bus shelters, for example, and the placement of shade and using public art for shade, or, looking at, can we have misters in public places, and what levels of complication and who's doing it and how is it working, or to even the color of paint on, public infrastructure and furniture, like benches and shade structures and how that can impact the heat. There's so much out there, and it's really exciting.
It goes back to no data, no AI. We actually, I'm not going to get into data privacy, but we do have an open data portal where everything is uploaded in a CSV format, XML format, which you can do. Again, all redacted, so I don't want to get pitchforks.
All right, well, look, we want to thank everyone. I'd like to thank my tremendous panel, and you guys can go to lunch now, I think.
Yeah.